Elvis was a very special person. He never turned no one down that was in need. He was a loving and caring person for everyone that he came in contact with, and most everyone loved him.
For 16 years after Elvis Presley died in that house, a woman was still living inside Graceland. Not visiting, not touring. Living there, full-time, in a bedroom tucked behind the kitchen, while millions of strangers walked past her door every single year. Most of those tourists had no idea she existed. Some of them met her without ever realizing who she was. And when they asked her, straight to her face, if she was Elvis's aunt, she sometimes looked them dead in the eye and told them Aunt Delta had died the night before. She hadn't. She was standing right there. Her name was Delta Presley Biggs, and by the time she actually did pass away in 1993, she had spent more years living inside Graceland than almost anyone else alive, including members of Elvis's own household staff. This is her story, and it's stranger, sadder, and a lot funnier than most people realize. Before any of that, before the dog walking, before the tourists, before she became a strange little rumor swapped between Elvis fans online, Delta Mae Presley was just Vernon Presley's younger sister. In the family, that made her Elvis's aunt, plain and simple, and for most of her life that's all she was. She married a man named Pat Biggs, the two of them never had children, and by most accounts she lived an unremarkable, private life well outside the chaos that had already swallowed her nephew whole by the time he was in his 20s. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. She wasn't angling for a place in the Presley story. She was just a sister, and later a wife, living her own version of an ordinary life a few states or a few miles away from the most famous house in America. Then her husband died, and everything about her situation changed. Losing a spouse with no children to lean on leaves a person in a strange kind of limbo, especially in the 1960s, when a widow's options were a lot narrower than they are today. Delta didn't have an obvious next chapter waiting for her. What she did have was family, and one branch of that family happened to own a mansion with plenty of room to spare. So sometime around 1966 or 1967, depending on which account you read, Delta packed up her life and moved into Graceland. It's worth slowing down on how ordinary that decision actually was, at least on the surface. There was no press conference. No magazine spread announcing that Elvis's widowed aunt had come to live with the family. It was simply a woman who had lost her husband moving in with relatives who had room and were willing to take her in, which is a story that has played out in countless families for as long as families have existed. The only thing that made it unusual was who those relatives happened to be. By the time Delta arrived, Graceland already housed Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae, and the mansion functioned less like a celebrity compound and more like a large, slightly overcrowded family home that happened to have a global superstar sleeping down the hall. Try to picture what that actually meant on a day-to-day basis. This wasn't a distant cousin dropping by for a holiday dinner once a year. Delta was living under that roof through the back half of the 1960s, through Elvis's Hollywood movie years, through the cultural earthquake of his 1968 comeback special, and eventually through the years he spent performing night after night in Las Vegas. She wasn't reading about any of it in a magazine at the newsstand. She was watching her nephew's transformation into a global icon unfold from the next room, one ordinary afternoon at a time. Elvis, by nearly every account from people who actually knew him, took care of the family around him. It wasn't a rumor invented after his death to soften his image. Friends, employees, and relatives who spent time in his orbit consistently describe a man who kept his family close, who made sure the people who mattered to him had a roof over their heads, and who built an entire section of his life around loyalty to the people who had known him before any of this happened to him. Delta was one of the people who benefited from that instinct. She had a home. She had family around her. And she had something almost nobody else on earth had, a front row seat to a life that most people could only imagine from the outside looking in. But a mansion full of relatives isn't automatically a peaceful place, especially when one of those relatives is being chased by flashbulbs and screaming fans every time he steps outside the gate. The very thing that made Graceland remarkable also made it a kind of pressure cooker. Every person living inside those walls absorbed some version of the chaos that came with being connected to the most famous man alive. The crowds outside the gates never really stopped. The demands on Elvis's time never let up. And the people closest to him, Delta included, lived inside that constant pressure whether they had signed up for it or not. So what did that actually look like, day to day, behind those walls? The picture that emerges from people who spent real time inside Graceland during those years isn't simple, and it isn't the polished, larger-than-life version of Elvis that most fans grew up with. It's closer to a portrait of a man pulled in two directions at once. On one side was Elvis the family man, generous almost to a fault, the one who made sure his relatives were fed and housed and looked after, capable of real warmth toward people who had known him long before fame ever entered the picture. On the other side was a man increasingly boxed in by his own legend, wrestling with isolation, constant scrutiny, and the sheer exhausting machinery of being Elvis Presley for every waking hour of every single day. Delta lived close enough to see both of those sides. She wasn't a fan standing outside a fence hoping for a glimpse. She was family, sharing meals, sharing hallways, sharing the small, unremarkable rhythms of a household that happened to have a rock and roll icon wandering through it in his bathrobe. She likely saw the version of her nephew who never made it into a magazine spread, tired after a long night of recording, short-tempered after another string of demands, simply human on an ordinary Tuesday, right alongside the version who could still light up an entire room the second he walked into it. That contradiction is really the heart of what makes the private side of Graceland so interesting. It wasn't a house overflowing with scandal. It was a house overflowing with contrast, warmth sitting right next to pressure, generosity sitting right next to exhaustion, family closeness sitting right next to a slow, creeping isolation, sometimes all in the same afternoon. In a smaller way, it's the kind of household dynamic plenty of families would recognize, just magnified here by fame, by money, and by a level of public attention most people never have to factor into their family dinners. Then, on August 16, 1977, that particular chapter of the family story ended abruptly. Elvis died at Graceland at the age of 42. It remains one of the most thoroughly documented events in modern music history, confirmed by medical examiners at the time, reported around the world within hours, and never seriously disputed by anyone with actual credibility. The king was gone, and the house he had built as a shelter for his family would never again be simply a family home. What happens to the people left standing in a house like that once the man who made it famous is suddenly, permanently gone? Elvis's death didn't empty Graceland all at once. It emptied slowly, one loss layered on top of another, and Delta was there for almost every stage of it. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, died 2 years after his son, in 1979. Then Minnie May, the grandmother who had shared that house with Delta for well over a decade, passed away the following year. One by one, the people who had filled Graceland with noise and family history were gone, and the bedrooms that once held them sat empty. The dinner table got quieter. The mansion that had once buzzed with the ordinary business of family life started to feel more like an echo of what it used to be. That left Delta alone, inside a mansion built for a legend, effectively holding down a home that increasingly belonged more to the world than to her own family. Every single other person who had once shared that roof with her was gone, and yet she stayed, in the same rooms, walking the same halls, while the entire estate slowly transformed around her into something else entirely. In 1982, Priscilla Presley made the call to open Graceland to the public. It was a business decision and a preservation decision rolled into one, and in a lot of ways it was probably unavoidable. Elvis Presley's home was too culturally and financially significant to simply sit there, decaying, while the estate figured out its next move. On opening day, more than 3,000 fans lined up to walk through the doors of a home that, until very recently, had been entirely private. But turning Graceland into a public attraction also created a strange, deeply personal problem for the one family member who was still actually living there. Delta's real home, her bedroom, her kitchen, her ordinary daily life, was about to become part of a guided tour, and she had absolutely no plans to move out. So an arrangement was made. Delta kept her bedroom, tucked just off the kitchen, well away from the path tourists would walk. That room, along with the kitchen surrounding it, stayed closed to visitors for years, carved out specifically so she could keep living the way she always had, largely undisturbed, even as thousands of strangers filed through the rest of the house every single day, snapping photos of a life that was still, technically, in progress a few feet away. Which raises the obvious question most tourists probably never even thought to ask. While thousands of strangers walked through the living room, past the white staircase, and into the jungle room, cameras raised, soaking in the legend, what was happening just a few feet away, behind a door none of them were ever allowed to open? This is where Delta Biggs stops being a footnote in someone else's biography and starts becoming a genuinely fascinating figure in her own right. By day, Graceland ran like clockwork. Tour groups moved through the mansion on a set schedule, guided past the same rooms, given the same reverent narration, everything curated for maximum emotional impact. And somewhere behind a closed door near the kitchen, an older woman with a small Pomeranian named Edmund lived her actual, unglamorous, day-to-day life, close enough to the spectacle to hear it through the walls. According to accounts that have circulated within the family for years, including comments attributed to Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, Delta had a sharp, unfiltered sense of humor about her strange living situation. She reportedly wasn't thrilled about being treated like a living exhibit next door to a museum, and when curious tourists occasionally spotted her walking her dog and asked if she happened to be Aunt Delta, she would sometimes brush them off entirely, telling them flatly that Delta had passed away the night before. It's the kind of story that has been repeated within the family for decades, less a scandal and more a glimpse of a woman who had simply grown tired of being treated as part of her own home's decor. There's something almost comic about that image once you actually sit with it. Somewhere inside America's most visited private residence, a woman in her 60s was walking her dog past strangers who treated her like part of the tour, and her response was to quietly mess with them rather than play along with whatever role they expected her to fill. It's a small detail, but it tells you a lot about who Delta really was underneath the last resident of Graceland label people eventually gave her. Sharp, a little stubborn, and not remotely interested in performing for an audience she never asked for. At night, once the last tour group had filed out and the doors were locked for the evening, something interesting happened. Delta would come out of her room and effectively have the run of the entire mansion to herself. According to comments attributed to Graceland's own archivist, Delta would sometimes rearrange small elements of the house during those quiet hours after closing, changing table settings, shifting little details around, small acts of ownership over a space that legally belonged to an estate but had once simply been hers to live in. It was even reportedly part of a conversation with Graceland's leadership about whether certain decor choices from Elvis's final years should be preserved exactly as they were when he died, a small but telling reminder that Delta wasn't just living inside a museum piece. She still thought of it as a home worth having an opinion about. Think about that contrast for a second. During the day, Graceland was a shrine to a fallen icon, roped off, narrated, photographed by thousands of strangers moving through on a schedule. At night, it quietly reverted to being somebody's actual home, with somebody still deciding where the placemats should go. So which version of the house was the real one? The polished museum thousands of people walked through every afternoon, or the after-hours house that only one woman still knew how to live inside? Now here's where a lot of the more sensational retellings of Delta's story tend to stretch things past what actually happened. Search around online long enough and you'll find versions claiming Delta exposed some hidden scandal about Elvis, some dark secret nobody else knew, some cover-up finally dragged into the light on her deathbed. The reality is both less explosive and, honestly, more interesting than that. Delta's real legacy was never a bombshell revelation. It was a first-hand, decades-long perspective on what it actually looked like to be related to Elvis Presley while the rest of the world was busy turning him into a myth. She didn't need to expose some hidden crime, because the truth she carried around with her for all those years was simpler and more human than that. Elvis was generous with the people he loved. He kept his family close even as fame kept dragging him further from anything resembling a normal life. And the pressure of being Elvis Presley 24 hours a day, every day, for 2 decades, took a visible toll on the people living around him, Delta included. That's not nothing. In a lot of ways, it's actually the harder story to tell, because it doesn't fold neatly into a single clickbait headline.